When Kenya reported the first cases of the new coronavirus in early March, the police jumped on the front line of fighting the disease, and they made headlines doing it, only not for the right reasons.
The National Police Service remains on the spotlight for the wanton brutality meted on Kenyans.
Police have reportedly been beating up locals as early as 6:30 p.m.
National Police Service remains on the spot for the wanton brutality meted out on Kenyans.
What the headlines revealed is the fact that the heavy-handed police approach to enforcing curfews and other restrictions was uniform in many other African countries. So, why are police officers in African countries so brutal with civilians even during a health pandemic?
I refuse to bow. I refuse.
In Kenya, at least 6 people died as a result of police violence during the first 10 days of the dusk-to-dawn curfew. At the time, there were only 4 coronavirus deaths in the country. The 6 people who died in the hands of the police had one thing in common. They were all from poor neighborhoods. Idris Mukolwe died when police lodged a tear gas canister at the open-air market in Kakamega. The youngest one, Yasin Moyo, a 13-year-old boy from Mathare, an informal settlement, was killed by a stray bullet while playing on his home balcony. The case was not different in Nigeria.
The Nigerian armed forces or security infrastructure in the country have never had a reason to do in some sort of nationwide lockdown or state of emergency before. So it's more or less part of a lack of capacity to manage such, and of course their own natural elements to abuse every opportunity that is given to them to maintain law and order in the country.
We will have a lockdown for 21 days to go out and wage war against an invisible enemy.
In South Africa, the army was deployed to enforce a nationwide lockdown starting March. When we spoke to Mia Malan from Bekisisa Center for Health Journalism in May, she pointed to a similar trend in her country.
The army has been mainly deployed in poorer areas, in townships, and not necessarily in middle-class areas. And as a result of that, those areas have been quite closely monitored, but they've also, because it's housing that doesn't necessarily have high fences like in middle-class areas around them, it's easy for police to see inside. Now, one of the rules in our lockdown was, or still is at the moment, we're in stage 4, we have different stages. We started with stage 5 for 5 weeks, and then we moved on about 2 weeks ago to stage 4. And during both of these stages, one of the rules that not many other countries have is that the sales of alcohol is banned. So you're not allowed to go and buy alcohol, and no shop is allowed to sell it. But it doesn't mean that you're not allowed to drink alcohol in your house, because if you manage to stock up on alcohol or make it yourself, then that's not necessarily illegal. But what has happened in townships is that the army would go around, and if they, for instance, see someone having a glass of wine in their yard, then they would become very, very brutal.
These 3 countries have different security policies, and the factors that led to police excesses vary in every context. However, one common factor cannot be ignored: history.
History goes back to the colonial period, which is, the police were established as a force to protect the property of the colonialists, and as they were building the railway, right? Mm-hmm. So the idea was that the African person was likely to be a problem for the installation of the colonial power and colonial infrastructure, and so they needed to be policed in a violent way, because it was also assumed that this is sort of the only language they would understand in order to follow the rules.
This is specific to the Kenyan context, where police would respond violently when enforcing colonial rules among black populations who lived mainly in low-income settlements. In South Africa, the apartheid legacy was characterized by brutal and violent use of force by law enforcement agents running from 1948 until the early 1990s. During that period, the country was dominated politically, socially, and economically by the nation's minority white population.
South Africa has a history of violence with the police. It didn't start just recently because of our apartheid history in the country. There is a history of the defense force often was deployed in townships and would go around really violently, putting people in their place, and regulating when there were rules of, you're not allowed to be in the streets, and be quite violent about it. And the police would also during those years, arrested people left, right, and center, and they would end up in jails and they would often die.
The most memorable act of police violence happened during the Soweto uprising in June 1976, where thousands of Soweto students were protesting the introductions of Afrikaans as language of instruction in their local schools. The peacefully demonstrating students were met with fire from the police, killing an estimated 176 people and injuring hundreds of them. Much like Kenya and South Africa, police community violence in Nigeria was institutionalized during colonial rule. The British colonial government established police forces who were employed in various colonial wars and punitive expeditions. One incident was the Women's War, which occurred in the eastern parts of the territory in the late 1929. The women were protesting against the warrant chiefs, whom they accused of restricting the role of women in the government. The colonial government deployed the military and police, resulting in the death of 55 women and serious injury to more than 50 women. Even after independence, most of these countries still use policing tactics borrowed from their colonial years. As a result of continued police violence, Africans are increasingly losing trust in security agencies. This survey released in May 2020 shows that small fractions of Africans trust the police.
Residents of the city are so nervous about crime. Even when crime is going down, the fear of crime doesn't go down, right? So people then are constantly calling on the police to be tougher on crime. And this tough on crime doesn't mean actually apprehending the actual criminals and taking them through the criminal justice system.
In Kenya, men account for 64% of extrajudicial murders and enforced disappearances within the last 13 years.
It's mainly to do with the idea of addressing crime in the city. And the fact that the people who live in formal settlements, especially the young men, are projected as the threat to safety of people and their property in the city.
By June 2020, 95 people in Kenya had been killed by the police, 18% of them in COVID-19 curfew-related restrictions. May recorded the highest with 24 deaths. During this period, journalist Asha Jafar was leading a food drive in Kibera, the largest informal settlement in Nairobi.
We had gone to look for database. Normally it takes a longer time because we do it prior to the food drive. So I was stuck in an area called Makina. I was getting like a few names still, and it started raining. So it started raining at around 6:30 and it went up until 7. I left that area, it was around 7:30. I took a boda from that area to my home place, and I found police like I think 100 meters away from my house. And they started whipping me from the back using hizo nyaunyo. And I fell from the pikipiki because it was very painful. Once I was down, they came and started continued whipping me, and they started asking me questions, and I shouted like I'm a journalist. I was working for the community at that particular time. They're like, oh, sorry. Once you're surrounded by like 10 policemen, there's nothing you can actually do.
This encounter left her with bruises on her body and back pains. At the beginning of June, police in Mathare gunned down John Mureithi, a homeless man who was fondly known as Baite. This death drove Kenyans to the streets in the midst of the pandemic, protesting the increased police brutality.
I lost my my daughter killed and the cover-up was done by police. I need justice to be done.
A major problem with police accountability is that whenever cases are brought up with the suggestion that there is a systemic problem, authorities are quick to dismiss it by saying not all officers are rogue.
When we say we have a systemic problem and we say we need to address the problem at a systemic level, we are not saying that we have a problem with all officers. We are saying that the system enables a lot of bad officers to get in and to stay and to even rise through the ranks. And it stops a lot of good officers from being able to stop the bad behavior of their colleagues, right? And we can't solve that by saying many of the officers are good.
Stop killing us! Stop killing us! Stop killing us!
On the 1st of April, President Uhuru Kenyatta issued an apology for the policing excesses.
Maybe in the initial stages there were some challenges, and I want to apologize to all Kenyans, maybe for some excesses that were conducted or happened.
He, however, did not issue a warning to the police to stop using excessive force. People were continually brutalized for minor infractions, such as not wearing masks.